I am. So how many of you are familiar with, well, let me sidestep that question. How many of you are developers? How many of you write plugins and themes? Okay. How many of you are from out of town? Okay. How many of you are familiar with the concept of extending a platform? Okay. So one of the things that I'm noticing as I'm doing more and more WordPress development is people who didn't start off with WordPress, people who are coming from other frameworks and other platforms are running into a lot of common problems. You know, they don't like how it's, you know, a blank screen when you start the theme. They don't like how it doesn't have a lot of guidelines. It's very open-ended. In the same way that when you're being a designer, looking at a blank canvas sucks. When you're building a theme and you're looking at a blank page and you've got a code, that can suck. So this is more geared towards people who are building themes, plugins, who've never used a framework, who don't like being limited and also don't like having a starting point. This will help you meet some of those more insane deadlines. Or if your budget doesn't exist, which is often the case. And then some tips on integrating external systems and working with teams and you know, all of that fun stuff that we deal with at Noble Studios, and I've dealt with other companies that I've worked at around the area. So I want to start off by getting some questions from you guys. What pains are you guys having while developing? What things are constantly coming up? Does anybody have anything?
Working with you.
Okay, besides that, any other questions? Okay. Okay. So basically, there are things there are quirks in WordPress. For instance, with the WP nav menu function, it's not documented as far as I know of, but if you use the menu parameter, it'll keep your order of your menu. So if you go to Appearance and Menu and you order things, it'll respect that ordering. But if you use the theme location parameter, it will just ignore it. That's not documented. That sucks. That slows down development. That can get in your head. How many of you are aware of the caching API within WordPress? How many of you have actually written using the caching API? Okay, that was a lot less than I was expecting. So the caching API in WordPress exists at a very abstract level. WordPress does not have a caching system involved. When you install it, nothing caches. You need to install an extension. You need to install a plugin. So if you're going to be writing a theme or if you're going to be writing a plugin and you're expecting it to actually do well, if you're expecting it to scale, you're going to need to start leveraging the caching API. So W3 Total Cache and WP Super Cache are fantastic plugins you can leverage. I won't go into all of the quirks of the caching API because that's pretty extensive, but the documentation on that is actually very robust. But I do recommend that if you haven't started playing with it, you start playing with it now because it will save you time in the future. So how many of you have started a theme from scratch? Wow, that's a lot more people than said that were developers. Holy crap.
Know your audience, Sterling.
Okay, let me rephrase the whole developers thing. How many of you have written code? Holy crap. Okay. Yes. Often that's the one and the same sometimes, unfortunately. Okay, you've written the word code. Thank you. So with some other platforms, when you're building it, I'm going to pick on a few ones like Joomla. When you're writing systems in Joomla, they come out in a very specific way. When you're writing in WordPress, it's a blank screen, so you can do anything you want in that system. And I'm actually going to bring up some examples of things that I've seen in the wild of really interesting WordPress websites. So this is on YouTube, but it's written in WordPress.
Bam.
Whole thing's written in WordPress. Because when you do WordPress, it's a blank theme. And that doesn't mean that you're limited to just doing blogs. That doesn't mean you're limited to just doing business websites. You can write applications. You can write marketing campaigns. And this is just one such example. How many of you have actually looked at the coding standards for WordPress? How many of you use them? That was, OK. So if you don't have your own coding standards, I suggest you adopt their coding standards. Whether or not you agree with their coding standards, it's better to have some coding standards than none. It will save you time in the long run. It'll make sure that the next developer picks up your work and actually deal with it. If you just kind of do cowboy coding and do it your own way, you're going to lose time in the long run. They're going to lose time in the long run. So I strongly suggest heating up the WordPress coding standards. They look like this. They have PHP, HTML, JavaScript. They're very well documented. They've actually come a long way in the last few years. So I strongly suggest you check those out. And then how many of you know that WordPress actually has a bunch of expected CSS classes out of the box? How many of you actually compensate for that and write those into your themes? Just like 90% of everybody who said they knew about them just said they don't use them. OK, so that's a reoccurring theme. So one of the things that I'll suggest is don't reinvent the wheel. If you know that they've got some out-of-the-box CSS classes, if you're a designer and you're doing cut-up, you should account for those. If you're doing front-end development, you should account for those. If you hate starting with an empty index.php page, these are a bunch of frameworks that you can use. Have any of you used any of these, and which ones have you used?
Options.
You've used Options? You like it?
Options, hybrid.
OK. Anybody else? OK.
Hybrid, thematic,
OK.
phones.
So have these saved you time? OK, there's a few in there.
Yes.
What slowed you down about them off the top of your head? Yeah.
It's trying to establish their mentality when they were building it, trying to figure out, okay, this is exactly what they were going for versus maybe this is possible. That's usually my big thing. It's like when you're writing code and then you give me the plugin, I try to figure out what it is you're trying to accomplish so I can accomplish the same thing.
So
OK.
different developer
And the framework that
perspectives.
you're using got in the way of understanding what it is you were trying to accomplish.
Right, because I've never used a developer before, so I'm not used to their technique, their style. You know?
OK. OK. Did they have good documentation?
Sure.
OK. All right.
So, or maybe if it's way too different from the WordPress API.
Right.
The WordPress API is what I know, and so if something's using has embedded a totally different MVC framework inside WordPress,
OK.
that's going to slow me down.
OK. How many of you have tried writing your own frameworks from scratch? 2 people. OK. For the record, I don't recommend doing that. Don't reinvent the wheel. An entire framework is something that's a long and involved process, and it was done by a large group of people for a very good reason. They don't do things in a vacuum. You may not like their style, but it will save you time. If you do it yourself, you're throwing away a bunch of people's hard work. I recommend you should at least look at some of these frameworks in order to speed up your development process. And now we're going to get into some standard developer jargon. How many of you are familiar with the concept of dry? Don't repeat yourself. OK. The concept of dry, don't repeat yourself, is pretty fundamental. When I look at a lot of people's cut-up and I look at a lot of themes still in the market, I'll see a list of a bunch of gallery items, and they're literally hand-coded into there. So you'll see 50 in a row. Dry would be turning that into a loop. That kind of stuff. That's critical. If you don't know what dry is and you haven't actually had a chance to put that into practice, you should start today. That's development 101. How many of you are familiar with rubber duck programming or pair programming? OK. So that concept is either taking an inanimate object or a person and just telling them about your code, telling them what it was supposed to do. So going back to what you were saying is that if you can't explain what your code should be doing, there's a good chance it's not going to work. So if you have another programmer that you can explain what this code is supposed to be doing, there's a high chance that you'll actually have it working and doing exactly what you mean to do. I've seen developers spend 4 hours just going, I have no idea why this isn't working. And the second they start explaining it in like 2 minutes, they solve it in their own head. So that's an invaluable way to fix your own coding. How many of you are familiar with the concept of refactoring? Okay. So who raised their hand? Jake, I'm going to pick on you.
Sure.
Why is refactoring important?
Why is refactoring important?
Yes.
Continuous improvements, making sure, in some sense it's a form of QA.
Yep.
Something more specific.
No, that's perfect. So Jake said that it's basically a form of QA, a form of quality control. It's an iterative process. Think of writing a book and then not being happy with how the book came out and realizing that if you had changed the perspective on something that you could actually go in there and just redo it at no cost and your end client, your reader, would benefit from that. Same thing with programming. You go in there and you say, okay, I'm not going to change how the story comes out. I'm just going to change how it was written. Refactoring is extremely great. It's great for code review, and it's definitely another one of the skills you want to pick up. I'm not going to go into object-oriented programming, but those are another thing that will help speed things up. I will give you an example of how object-oriented programming can help speed up theme development. So this is one of the frameworks that we use at Noble. That's what she said. Sorry. All right. So this is a very light framework. Can you guys see that, or is the colors like completely washing it out?
That's partly the projector. I don't know.
Yeah, that's
how
the
much we'll do
projector.
about it.
Okay. So we'll do this. Okay, you can see that, right? I figured that might happen, so I put the code up there. So this is a part of a framework that we've written at Noble Studios. And when I said don't write your own framework, I really mean it, unless like you're going to be using it every other day yourself. So this is just a very abstract class that we've written that helps us write code and maintain code. We have a class, we've got a function that does run, and from right here, you don't need to see any of the other functions, but you already know what this theme does. So being verbose in your code will help. Being consistent in your code will help. So some of the things that, and I wish I could show you the code right now towards, because there were some speaking points in the other talks that just happened about enqueuing scripts. So those functions that you may have seen are WP enqueue scripts. We actually have abstracted that out, so we can have an entire array that's returned and all the dependencies. And actually, we only call our application.css and our application.style, and then it loads all scripts and all styles having to do with the actual website. How many of you know that you don't need style.css to build a theme? Like, it doesn't need to be included. It's just there for the activation of the theme. Okay. How many of you are doing cross-browser testing? Everybody's doing cross-browser testing. How many of you are doing cross-platform testing? Okay. How many of you do not understand why cross-platform testing is important? Okay. So cross-platform testing, when I say cross-platform testing, I mean you're testing it on the iPhone, the iPad, the Android. Those are separate platforms. So, I mean, just right there, you immediately understand why and how that's important. How many of you actually understand what it is to cache something? How many of you don't? OK. So caching is basically taking all the work that it takes to produce an end file from the server. So think if you're trying to render just your home page. OK, there's work that goes into that. Taking the end product and taking a snapshot, putting it on the server, and the server just looks at that instead of trying to redo the work. OK, that's a very abstract level of doing caching. All of these, and I'll put this slideshow up, all of these are worthwhile reading if you want to actually speed up your development process. How many of you are students? OK, if you're a student and you're looking to get into the market for development just in general, every one of these is relevant to what you're doing. How many of you are familiar with the content delivery network? OK. And how many of you actually know what the cloud is?
Nobody knows the cloud.
Nobody knows the cloud. You were waiting for that one.
I was.
How many of you using version control systems? Okay. Which ones are you guys using? Who's using Git? Who's using Mercurial? Nobody's using Mercurial. It's sad. How many of you are using Subversion? Okay. Okay. If you're not using a version control system, you should start immediately. You should have started yesterday. You'll lose all of your code overnight, and you'll hate yourself in the morning, and version control would have fixed that. Your whole computer would have blown up, and version control could have prevented it. It solves world hunger, many major diseases.
Would have just destroyed itself too.
Yep. There have been moments where developers have stayed up, 20 hours programming, and then they make one keystroke mistake, lose all of their code, and then, without version control, there's no way to go back. With version control, it's 2 commands, and you're back to exactly where you need to be. How many of you are using IRC? Okay, okay. How many of you know that there's an IRC channel for WordPress? Okay, I strongly recommend learning IRC. It's a chat client. If you have questions about WordPress, whether that's design, whether it's development, whether it's, hey, I installed a plugin and it's not working, you can go into this chat thing and there's like 500 people just sitting around waiting to answer your questions for free. So learn IRC, that's critical. How many of you are part of local developer groups? Okay. Shout out to the Reno-PHP group. What other groups are here? Just so all the developers here know and all the students know where to go. Reno.js, Reno-PHP, there's the Reno WordPress group.
Reno-Tahoe Women Who Code.
Women Who Code. Any other ones? So all the things that I'm talking about are tools that will help you become better developers in general. They'll also help you extend WordPress. Don't be afraid to ask for help. That's one of the main things that I see in most developers is they hate asking for help, period. So ask, even if you're embarrassed, you ask another developer. You go into IRC, you'll ask. You can shoot me an email. You can hit anybody up on Twitter. Ask away. You're not wasting anybody's time by asking questions that are relevant to the field. So one thing that I'm noticing in the field is that developers are stagnating. They'll get into WordPress. They'll spend 6 months learning, and they'll say, OK, there's nothing more to learn. How many of you have felt there's nothing more to learn in WordPress? Yeah, I'd ask. So there's one of the things about WordPress is that you can extend it, you can read all the documentation, and you will probably have been pigeonholed anyway into one set of projects. You'll never actually do all the things you could have done with WordPress. It's not a silver bullet, but it is a very powerful tool. So that's why I showed you some of the marketing things that I showed you earlier. So some of the guys on my team have been pigeonholed into work. If they're doing Facebook apps, or they're doing web app development. One of the things that I've seen with a lot of WordPress developers is blog development. You get pigeonholed into that. Don't let that happen. If you get pigeonholed into one thing over a period of time, you'll lose all the other skills. They'll atrophy. So make sure to rotate your work out. One thing that I'm noticing that agencies and marketing still need, they still need ways to justify the platforms. And people like Jake are actually really great at this. They can go up to enterprise companies and just say, we're using WordPress, and give a list of justifications for it. There's no public resources that are really awesome for that. People still ask us, why are we using WordPress as opposed to another platform? So if you guys want to start any of those projects locally, that would be huge to actually moving the WordPress movement forward. So that would actually lead to more extending projects. We have a few open source projects on GitHub. We're at /Noblebots. And then these are a few other front-end frameworks, Bootstrap and Foundation, Sass and Less. How many of you are familiar with any of those? Holy crap. Just a quick show of hands. Who prefers Sass? Who prefers Less? OK, why do you prefer Less? OK, OK. OK, OK. Do you guys know both Less and Sass? OK.
Could you maybe summarize some of the differences?
Right. So Less and Sass, the developers know each other. They're good friends. They're abstract ways of compiling CSS. So you can take, you can actually use variables. So you can say light blue is equal to X, Y, and Z, and then you can reuse that through your CSS thing instead of having to change all of your hex values on 1,000 lines. One of the main fundamental differences that we've seen at Noble between Less and Sass is Less has maybe a couple features that Sass doesn't have. Sass has mixins, which I don't think Less has. Less does some funny things with math. So a good example is if you take 10 pixels and say minus 10%, which you can do in either one of these things, it will remove 10 pixels from 10 pixels, which is not 10%. So we use Sass internally in our agency because of that one reason only. We need accuracy. But I recommend learning any of these. I already showed this code. How many of you don't understand what a namespace is or what the bottom part is where it says theme run? OK. When writing your theme, and this is a common mistake I'm seeing when you're developing a theme or a plugin, is people will create their theme or plugin and prefix it with like 30 characters. Be like, this is my theme. And it'll, that's really hard to type in. But it's the best idea that they have at the time to avoid conflicts. Another way you can do it is using namespacing. Namespacing is available in PHP 5.4. How many of you are using PHP 5.4? OK. OK. How many of you are using 5.3 and know why you're not using 5.4? Why are you not using 5.4?
We can't count on people using WordPress using 5.4.
That's a great response. So if you're an internal agency hosting your own applications, you can do what you want. If you're doing what you want on your own servers, you can, of course, use whatever version you want. But if you're actually writing a plugin or a theme, you should stick with 5.3. Dot 2?
Minimum requirements 5.2.
OK.
2.1. Thank you.
OK, so that's a good point.
5.2.1.
When writing your plugin and writing your theme, you should adhere to the standards that WordPress adheres to. So if they bump up to 5.3, you can bump up to 5.3. If they're stuck on 5.2, you stay on 5.2. So this is probably bad. Don't use namespacing. It'll probably break. Don't use this. It'll probably break. So this right here is new in 5.4. It allows you to, instead of assigning something to a variable, to just run it as a class. Here's an example of it. So that's how you have to do it right now, if you can see that.
Select it.
Yeah, you have to assign the
You should select it.
OK.
That doesn't
Yeah.
Oh, much better.
There you go.
Yeah. All right.
The accessibility.
Accessibility. Yeah. That's awesome. OK. So right now, in 5.2 and 5.3, when you're instantiating a new object, which is what this is doing, it's an instantiation of a class, you have to assign it to a variable, and you've got to then execute the methods on it. In 5.4, you can do something which I like a little bit better, but it's just a bit of candy. It's not really important. You can just do this. So it's not instantiating anything. It's not assigning it to a variable. There's no cleanup involved. You just say, run the method within this class.
What if something else wants an instance of your class?
They can just create and assign it to a variable. They don't need to take your current instance. And in WordPress, that's actually, it can be difficult unless you did that intentionally. You want somebody to take your current instance. So if you're gonna write a plugin or a theme that you want people to extend upon, as you're writing it, you should be extending upon it. If you just write it and then expect people to be able to extend upon it, it'll fail. It'll break. So a really good example would be, I'm noticing a lot of people who are using Tim Thumbs. How many of you are familiar with the Tim Thumb library? How many of you are familiar with why you shouldn't use it? OK. It's OK to use if the author keeps up to date on all the updates. But a really major exploit came out not too long ago where there was a vulnerability in it, and the authors didn't update their WordPress themes. And pretty much every WordPress website that had the plugins or themes using that got hacked. So that's a critical thing to know, is that when you're writing something that people are going to leverage, writing something that people are going to extend with, you should be using it yourself. You should also keep it up to date. So once again, are there any actual problems that you guys are seeing day to day as coders, not developers, because that got weird? Any actual problems that you guys are seeing day to day in coding? OK. Any other questions?
How
Yeah.
about
Do you have any suggestions for people being more verbose on their code?
Yeah.
suggestions for people being more verbose?
Being, assimilated into a team?
OK. So the question is that if you're going to be verbose on variables, what are some suggestions that you have? So there's some guidelines that I picked up in coding. Is like, if you're writing a function, don't use more than three variables if you can avoid it. It makes your code cleaner. Describe what your function's doing. That doesn't compensate for commenting. You should always document your code, but you should, like, if you're going to be adding a button, add _button would be sufficient for your function name. If your function name is 30 characters long to describe what it's doing, you probably need to break it out into smaller functions. Every function should have a very simple purpose. That's my advice on that one. Speak in English. That helps. Don't switch languages in midstream.
I want it.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
have a number of cities that use Code Fusion
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
Converting Cold Fusion to WordPress.
No.
It's the open source, a security risk.
So
Ask them whether Linux or Windows is more secure. Ask them whether Linux or Windows is more secure.
So the question is that we're using Cold Fusion and we're transferring to WordPress. Are there security concerns? Are there best practices for that? Is that correct? Is that on point?
How do you justify telling your client that WordPress is the same? It's an open source thing.
It's OK. Yeah. So open source. OK. So there's a misconception, and it's my opinion that it's a misconception, that transparency and openness are inherent security flaws in something. I don't believe that. I believe that the more you expose, the more secure it can be. Yeah, because to be quite honest, developers love to call you on your shit. So if they see something's broken, or if they see there's something to actually fix, they will fix it. WordPress is like 80% of the blogging market, and for good reason. And 80% of the blogging market is not hacked. So it's not WordPress that's just the security problem. It's developers writing bad plugins or bad themes. That goes for Cold Fusion, and that goes for any platform. So if you're going to migrate from Cold Fusion to WordPress, which I would strongly recommend, I'm not a big Cold Fusion fan, I have no concerns there, and I would recommend that, as Jake pointed out, Linux environments are more secure than Windows environments for web hosting. Yeah, and if you really wanted to, you can host WordPress on Windows. But yeah, I see no concerns with open source in general.
They have doubts about PHP as opposed to Cold Fusion. PHP is also open source programming language.
So
There's a lot of bias, I guess, within the cities where they sort of favoring Windows and ASP. That's the challenge.
So Facebook uses PHP. A lot of very big companies use PHP.
PHP versus Cold Fusion.
I think one of the best ways to win those arguments is to show your stakeholders who's using WordPress versus who's using Cold Fusion. And I can tell you right now, I can name one major name off the top of my head that's doing a good job with Cold Fusion. I think that's Linode. They're using Cold Fusion. Outside of that, I can name dozens of companies that are using WordPress: New York Times, Google, Autodesk. Yeah, CNN. You've got huge billion, trillion-dollar corporations using open source code. And Microsoft has started an open source division. which means they're hopping on the train because they realize if they don't, they're going to get left behind. So that's what I would say about open source. Any other questions? Yeah.
This is really kind of specific, but
It's fine.
I seem to have a lot of problems with some of, because I'm kind of new,
Yeah.
with some of the closed box functions in WordPress, like comments or menus, which just came up. Any good ways of exposing those or getting more information about those things?
Yes. So I'm going to teach you to fish. I'm going to teach you to fish at 72 font size. Okay. Are you familiar with the file structure of WordPress?
Reasonably.
Okay.
You hate your eyes, don't you, Sterling?
I do.
It's totally apparent.
Okay. So I don't hate my eyes that much. So you should go into here to your config file, and then you should find this line. In this instance, it's line 81, but you should find WP debug. Turn that to true. So if you're using plugins or themes or whatever, and they're just breaking, this will expose at least an error. That's key. And then making sure that your PHP, and you can Google this, you can make sure that your PHP errors are turned on.
Yeah, no, that part is there.
Okay.
Maybe I should refine my question.
Okay.
Although what you just said is very helpful, I'd like to refine this a little bit more. Some of the functions themselves in WordPress are just closed box. I have no idea how to modify them without going into the core files. That's what I'm wondering about. How do you expose more of this stuff, or where do you get more information beyond the WordPress codex?
Can you give me an example of a function?
Comments. WP.
So,
Comments.
altering the comments without having to touch the core files is what he's trying
Right. Exactly.
Yep.
Thank you.
to do. You're welcome. It's not my problem.
So the comments template or just comments in general?
Like the comment box, okay, so out of the box,
Right.
right, there's the comments on the blog page.
Yes.
He's talking about altering that comments page.
So there's comments.php in the theme.
In the child, yeah.
Okay, so you can-
child theme it.
You could child theme it, or you could just edit your theme. If you wrote the theme, you can edit comments.php and change up the entire aesthetic. There is, at the moment, an out-of-the-box WordPress theme for comments, and you can just call that with the...
As a child theme then?
You can do it as a child theme, yes. I'd hate to say it's as easy as that. There's a good chance that you're going to need to look at your parent theme and see if they're doing any...
What's going on.
Yeah.
But that would expose, having all of that would expose or answer a lot of questions. So.
Right. So one of the things I do hear a lot from a lot of developers is that there's no documentation on a particular subject A, B, C. We just talked about one of those, and it's our responsibility as developers to go to the codex and update their documentation. If we don't do that, then we don't get to talk about how there's no documentation. So I want to make sure that's absolutely clear, is we always should add to the community when we can. Any other questions?
I'll give you a list of yourself.
That is my loving and supporting team over there from Mobile Studios. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Sterling. So that was really great. Get our code on a little bit, and that gives us 10 minutes also. I know we have our sponsor pick box out there somewhere, or we did. If they're still there, you can go take your pictures, share them if you haven't done that yet. I mentioned during the talk the Reno-Tahoe Women Who Code meetup group. They actually asked me if I'd announce that. Their next meetup is May 2nd, and they're on meetup.com. And I think that's it. We got a 10-minute break. We'll see you at 3.